Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon we're going to be looking at a game played between Akiba Rubinstein and Karl Schlechter. This was played in the 1912 San Sebastian Masters Tournament in San Sebastian, Mexico, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Rubinstein starts off by playing the move d4, and we have d5 by Schlechter. Knight f3, knight f6, c4, and now e6. So we get the queen's gambit declined. And after knight c3, c5, we get the semi-Tarrasch, and now c takes d5. So Rubinstein is the first player to break the tension, and now after knight takes d5, we have e4. So now it's kind of reminiscent to the Grunfeld defense, where you're going to play knight takes d5, and then white goes e4, and then, like what happens in the Grunfeld, you take on c3. After bc3, c takes d4. And after c takes d4, the bishop comes out to b4 with check. So it's already move 8, and we have gotten some exchanges. And after bishop b4 check, there are going to be more exchanges. So let's see how this happens. Bishop d2, queen to a5 now. Defending the bishop. Although you could play bishop takes d2 check right away, and then just castle. Schlechter decides to play queen a5 with the idea of maybe trying to exchange more pieces, develop his knight, and then maybe undermine the central pawns that are at the moment controlling some of black's territory. Rook to b1, and now you don't really have a choice but to play the move bishop takes d2 check, since going knight c6 would just also trade the bishops off. In either case, you're just going to have to trade the bishops off. So bishop d2, queen d2, queen d2, king d2, and now castles. The bishop comes out to b5 and a6, because Schlechter wants to develop his knight out to c6, but he doesn't want Rubinstein to capture the knight, and then play knight to e5, and then essentially prevent him from developing his pieces. Since if that were to occur, then it would be worse for Schlechter. You should also note that it's going to be very hard for Schlechter to develop all of his pieces. For instance, if he goes knight to d7, then a sample variation could just be bishop takes d7, or even just simply going rook hc1. This also works to just infiltrate on the 7th or 8th rank. And the idea is to simply play rook takes c8, and after you capture either with this rook or this rook, the knight on d7 is going to hang. So that's one option, but you could also just think about taking on d7. Although that wouldn't really win you a pawn, since after bishop takes d7, rook takes b7, there's just bishop c6, and the e4 pawn is going to be lost. However, this would give your rook a very powerful entry point into black's position, and although you wouldn't really gain a lot of material, it could still be fine for an attack. So, although you could play knight d7 as black and develop that way, Schlechter doesn't really want to play that type of position. And other moves might include something like bishop to d7, which actually does loses the pawn, because the knight can't go and capture any of the pawns that are in the center. So bishop d7 doesn't work, and going knight a6 is just very ugly, because after bishop a6, ba6, just knight e5, and you can't really develop this bishop out to d7, you can't develop it out to b7, and you have to play the rook to d8 to at least get it out to d7. But after king e3, something like this, rook c1, white is better because they're going to have more control of the open files, and let's say this rook gets into the c7 square. It's going to be a really hard task for black to remove that rook, and that too stabilizing the position, because the a6 pawn is doubled with the a7 pawn, and it's just going to be really hard here from now on for black to play this position. So you can't really develop either of your pieces that way. It's just not possible. So a6. And what Schlechter wants to do is at least kick the bishop away, so that now you can easily develop your pieces. Now knight c6 is definitely an idea. However, before doing that, Schlechter decides to play rook d8. And the idea now is that when you play knight c6 on the next move, you're going to be threatening the d4 pawn. So rook hc1, and although you could still go knight c6, b5. And it makes you wonder, why would Schlechter play a6, kick the bishop back, and not even play the knight out to c6? Well, he has a different plan, And after rook c7, knight d7, king e3, knight f6, his plan is basically to maneuver the pieces out this way, and maybe there are actually some places that this knight on f6 can go to that can nicely attack the infiltrators that are coming into black's position. Like at the moment, this rook on c7 is definitely an annoying piece. For instance, knight to e8 to try attacking it is an idea. But first, Rubinstein plays knight e5, and you cannot exactly attack the rook with knight to e8 because your f7 pawn is going to fall. So bishop to d7, blocking the attack towards the f7 pawn. g4, h6, because if you do not do anything here, the move g5 will be played. Your knight is going to be hit, and then after that, the knight would have to move back, and then you just take the bishop. So h6, preventing that. f4, you want to play the move g5. So bishop e8. Schlechter says that if you're going to play g5, I'm fine with it, because you're not going to be winning any material. Not the f7 pawn, not the bishop on d7. So you can go g5 all you want, and that is exactly what Rubinstein does. So he plays g5, h takes g5, f takes g5, and now after knight h7, the move h4 is played. And the idea is to simply bring this rook to g1, maybe go h5 and then g6, and you know, a pawn struck right in black's territory can really be helpful for Rubinstein, not only because it's just going to support some other pieces to come into black's territory, but also because it could just restrict the movement of Schlechter's king. Rook dc8, and now rook bc1. The rooks are traded off, and rook to d8. Rook to a7, and now f6, kicking the knight away, so we have all these trades, and after knight g4, bishop to h5. But this is a mistake, and unfortunately for Schlechter, he has no way of actually defending the a6 pawn. The problem is that he cannot play rook to d6, because if he could, then he definitely would have played this move. However, the problem is that rook takes h7 is present in the position, and the only real move that you could actually play is king takes h7, but now there's knight f6 check, and this is the problem. So you must go something like king to h8, and now after knight takes e8, Rubinstein is just up material. He has two minor pieces for the rook, and an extra pawn, which is just going to be an insane amount of compensation. So you cannot exactly play rook to d6 and defend the a6 pawn. So bishop h5, Schlechter tries to at least attack the knight, and after it moves, then maybe play rook to d6. However, even if the knight did move back to f2, not to h6 like it did in the game, you still cannot exactly play rook to d6, because there's rook takes h7 still. And if you go king takes h7, e5 check is present, and your rook is going to be hanging. But Schlechter had some plan that maybe something could work here. However, nothing really worked in his favor. Knight h6 check, king h8, and now, okay, you could capture the pawn on a6, but bishop to e2. What does Rubinstein want to do, you might be asking? Well, because now, if you play bishop takes e2, there's knight f7 check, and the rook is going to be captured on the next move. So, bishop e2 doesn't work, and if you go bishop to g6, then it would just be the same thing, just going bishop to e8, because white would just go h5, and it'll just be the same position, really. So bishop takes e2, nor bishop g6 really works, so that's why bishop e8. The rook captures the pawn on a6, now threatening e6 as well. King goes to g7, and now knight to g4, attacking the f6 pawn, or at least putting pressure on it for the moment. The pawn goes to f5, rook comes to a7 with a check, king goes back into the corner, and now knight to e5. And the problem is that Schlechter took very long to actually develop all of his pieces, activate them, etc., that he can't actually use them efficiently now. And you can see that all of his pieces stuck on the back rank, maybe except the knight, are basically not doing anything to really help the safety of Schlechter's king. So f takes e4, bishop takes b5. Now if you take the bishop, then just knight f7 check. Same idea, you're going to lose the rook. So that's why knight f6 was played, and now after bishop e8, rook e8, king f4 is played. Hoping to activate the king and then bringing it to g5, and then maybe even create mating nets. because of how vulnerable the black king is to a lot of different attacks. So king g8, king g5, rook comes to f8 to defend, but after king to g6 was played, Rubinstein actually won the game from resignation by Schlechter. And this is mainly because there's no way to actually prevent all of the attacks that are present in the position, or even the mate threats, such as rook g7, maybe even knight f7 and knight h6 check, and even bringing the h-pawn down the board. And that's basically it. There's no way to stop all of this. So that's why after the move king to g6 was played, Schlechter resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Akiva Rubinstein. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.